The clash of swords echoes through the streets of Rome. We often see this city as an eternal monument of marble and stone, but for centuries it was the ultimate prize, fought over and plundered by countless armies. This is the story of 35 epic sackings that scarred the Eternal City, from its legendary beginnings to the twilight of the Middle Ages. You are about to embark on an epic, story-driven historical adventure through tales of barbarian hordes, rival emperors, and the incredible resilience of a civilization that refused to die. By the end, you will understand the true price of glory and the hidden strength that allowed Rome to endure catastrophe after catastrophe. How did a city survive being stripped of its treasures not once, but dozens of times, and what dark secrets were left behind in the rubble? What does it truly take for a civilization to survive its own destruction? The first great disaster began not with a siege, but with a rout. A Gallic army, a vast tide of warriors from the north, met the Roman legions at the river Allia. The Romans were utterly crushed, their lines broken and scattered in a defeat so total it would forever be remembered as a day of ill omen. The road to Rome lay open and undefended. Panic seized the city. Most who could flee did, but a corps of soldiers and senators retreated to the steep, fortified Capitoline Hill, the sacred heart of the city, believing it impregnable. The Gauls, led by their chieftain Brennus, entered a nearly empty city. They looted and burned, but their eyes were fixed on the final prize, the capital. For months, the small band of defenders held out, their situation growing more desperate by the day. Then, during a silent night assault by the Gauls, a miracle, or perhaps just some noisy birds, intervened. The sacred geese of the goddess Juno, kept on the hill, began to honk and flap their wings, alerting the sleeping Romans to the enemy climbing the cliffs. The attack was repulsed and the hill was saved, yet starvation eventually forced the defenders to negotiate. Brennus demanded a massive ransom of gold to leave. As the Romans weighed out the payment, they complained that the Gallic weights were dishonest. In that moment, Brennus threw his own heavy sword onto the scale, declaring those infamous haunting words, "Vi victis." Woe to the vanquished! The message was brutal and clear. The rules are written by the winners. This first sack was a searing national humiliation that burned itself into the Roman soul. It forged a paranoia about barbarian invaders from the north, a fear that would echo for centuries, and it ignited an unyielding drive for military dominance, a resolve that Rome would never again be so vulnerable, so utterly defeated. This was the wound that created an empire. Centuries of iron discipline and that burning resolve forged after the Gallic humiliation had built an empire that seemed unshakable. Yet by the year 410, that mighty edifice was rotting from within. The Western Roman Empire was a hollow shell, its frontiers bleeding, its treasury empty, and its throne a prize for squabbling generals. Into this power vacuum stepped a man who knew the Romans all too well, Alaric, king of the Visigoths. He was not some unknown barbarian from the wilds. He was a former Roman ally, a military commander who had served the empire. He felt cheated. His people granted poor land and little respect after their service. For years, he tried to negotiate, to force the empire in Ravenna to grant his people a proper homeland and the provisions they were owed. He marched his army through Italy, not as a mindless destroyer, but as a strategic negotiator, using the threat of force to get a seat at the table. He blockaded Rome itself to pressure the emperor, but the court in Ravenna, safe behind its marshes, remained stubborn. Alaric's patience finally snapped. He turned his entire army back towards the Eternal City. And then, on August 24th, 410, the impossible happened. Under the cover of night, the massive Salarian gate swung open. Was it opened by sympathetic slaves or disgruntled Roman citizens who saw no future with their current rulers? We may never know for sure. But the result was absolute. The Visigothic warriors poured into the sleeping city, For 3 days, Alaric let his men loot. This was not a frenzy of mindless destruction. It was a systematic, controlled harvesting of wealth. The primary goal was plunder, gold, silver, silk, and treasures to reward his long-suffering army, not the annihilation of the city itself. Churches, for instance, were largely spared, as Alaric was a Christian, albeit of a different sect. But the symbolic impact was earth-shattering. For the first time in 800 years since Brennus and his Gauls, the city of Rome had been taken by a foreign enemy. The news sent a shockwave of disbelief across the entire ancient world. How could the invincible heart of the world, the cradle of civilization, have fallen? The event was so psychologically devastating that many saw it as the end of the world itself, a clear sign that the gods had abandoned Rome. 45 years after Alaric's calculated plunder, the gates of Rome swung open once more, but this time for a king who had perfected the art of extraction. Where the Visigoths sought a bargaining chip and a payment, Gaiseric and his Vandals arrived from Carthage with a singular, chilling purpose: to systematically strip the eternal city of every ounce of its remaining wealth. This was not a negotiation by other means, it was a harvest. Gaiseric himself was a master strategist, a cunning ruler who had built a powerful pirate kingdom in North Africa and commanded a fleet that ruled the Mediterranean waves. He did not march overland, he sailed, a move that demonstrated his naval dominance and caught a dying empire completely by surprise. The same Pope Leo who had famously met Attila the Hun and, through sheer force of personality, persuaded him to turn away, now stood before Gaiseric. There would be no miraculous reprieve this time. The Pope could not stop the sack, he could only plead for the lives of Rome's citizens, a plea to which Gaiseric perhaps pragmatically agreed. For 14 days, the Vandals conducted their work with a cold, methodical efficiency that would become legendary. They did not simply ransack, they catalogued and collected. This was a planned, logistical operation to transfer the accumulated treasures of centuries from Rome to the Vandal capital of Carthage. The plunder was so breathtakingly thorough that it seared the Vandal name into history, forever giving us the word vandalism to signify mindless destruction, though their actions were anything but mindless. They were devastatingly precise. They took everything, the sacred spoils of the temple in Jerusalem, brought to Rome by Titus centuries earlier, the gilded bronze tiles that sheathed the roof of the temple of Jupiter Optimus Maximus on the Capitoline Hill, statues, gold, silver, and countless artistic masterpieces. When Gaiseric's fleet finally sailed away, they left behind a city that was not just looted but hollowed out. Rome was materially impoverished, yes, but the theft of its most sacred and symbolic artifacts struck a deeper blow, leaving it spiritually barren. The Vandal sack was a calculated dismantling of a world, proof that the empire could now be bled dry by anyone with a strong enough navy and a ruthless enough will. Yet by the middle of the 6th century, the empire in the west was a ghost, its throne long vacant. The real power now resided in the east, in the glittering capital of Constantinople, where the Emperor Justinian dreamed of stitching the old Roman world back together. His grand project, the Reconquest, ignited a war of attrition so brutal it would become known simply as the Gothic War, a conflict that ravaged Italy for nearly 2 decades. And in this struggle, Rome was no longer the ultimate prize, but a strategic pawn to be captured, recaptured, and sacrificed on a bloody chessboard. Leading the Ostrogothic resistance was a king of remarkable energy and charisma, Totila. He was more than a barbarian chieftain. He was a leader who offered freedom and land to Roman slaves and peasants, building a popular movement that challenged the imperial war machine. In the year 546, his forces approached a Rome that was a shadow of its former self. Its population shrunk to a mere fraction, its grand buildings crumbling. The Byzantine garrison, knowing they could not hold the vast, depopulated circuit of walls, simply abandoned their posts and fled. Totila walked into a city that was already empty. His first act was one of pure military strategy, to prevent the Byzantines from ever using Rome as a fortress against him again. He began to dismantle entire sections of the massive Aurelian walls. He was methodically breaking the city's teeth, but then something shifted in his strategy. Perhaps he saw the hollowed-out metropolis not as a threat but as a symbol. A king of Italy needed a capital. In a stunning reversal, Totila stopped the demolition, sent out messages inviting the scattered inhabitants to return, and even began repairs. He hosted chariot races in the crumbling Circus Maximus, a poignant attempt to restart the heart of the old world. This sack, if it can even be called that, reveals a profound change. Rome was now so reduced that its conqueror felt pity. Totila did not want to destroy the city's legacy. He wanted to claim it for himself, to become the new ruler of a living Rome, not a pile of stones. His actions show the complex, almost tragic relationship between a conqueror and the immortal idea he sought to possess. The city had become a stage for the ambitions of others, its fate swinging between demolition and revival on the whim of a king fighting for his own kingdom's survival. But the respite Totila offered was tragically brief. The Byzantine war machine, commanded by the brilliant and relentless General Narses, was not finished with Italy. They had already retaken the city once before, only to lose it again. Now, in the year 549, Totila found himself cornered. His grand project of a revived Ostrogothic Rome was collapsing, and he needed a decisive blow. So he marched on the Eternal City one last time. This time, there was no talk of chariot races or inviting citizens back. This was a military operation born of desperation. The Byzantine garrison was weak, and Totila's forces smashed through the defenses. His final seizure of Rome was far more brutal than his first. It was a sack driven by strategic necessity and perhaps a flicker of vengeance. He knew he could not hold the city against Narses' approaching army, so he aimed to leave nothing of value for the enemy. What he could not take, he destroyed. The plunder was systematic and the damage was severe. But the true tragedy was for the civilians who had dared to return, who had begun to hope under his brief rule. Once more, they were caught in the grinding gears of a war between two titans, their lives and meager possessions forfeit to the strategies of distant emperors and ambitious kings. The city became a ghost town for a second time, its streets echoing not with life, but with the sounds of looting and preparation for a siege that everyone knew was coming. Totila did not linger. He took his army and his plunder north to meet Narses in a final, fateful battle. At the Battle of Tagini, the Ostrogothic dream was extinguished. Totila was defeated and killed, his body left on the field. His two sacks of Rome, one hopeful and the other desperate, perfectly capture the agonizing cycle of this period. The city was not a prize to be won, but a tool to be used and discarded. A testament to the extreme suffering of a population forever trapped between two powerful, indifferent armies. The cycle of siege and abandonment had left Rome a fragile shell, but a new kind of threat was emerging from the north, one of relentless, grinding pressure. The Lombards arrived not for a single, spectacular plunder, but to stay. Throughout the 8th century, their armies did not just raid the countryside, they settled it, carving out a kingdom in the north of Italy and pushing steadily southward. Their goal was not the symbolic looting of a dying city, but the complete conquest of the Italian peninsula itself. For the Bishop of Rome, the Pope, this was an existential crisis far more dangerous than any fleeting sack. The Lombards directly threatened the papacy's growing temporal power, the lands and revenues that funded its influence and fed its people. If they took Rome, the Pope would become a mere subject in a Lombard kingdom, his spiritual authority crushed under a foreign boot. The old protectors in Constantinople were now distant and impotent, too preoccupied with their own wars and theological disputes to send aid. Rome was truly on its own, facing a slow, suffocating encroachment that no walls could forever hold back. In this moment of supreme peril, Pope Stephen Roman II made a desperate and unprecedented decision. He would not wait for the end. He would cross the Alps himself, a journey of immense hardship, to personally seek an alliance with the one people strong enough to counter the Lombard tide, the Franks. This was not a request for a temporary mercenary army. It was a plea for a new world order. The meeting between the spiritual leader of Latin Christendom and the Frankish king, Pepin the Short, was a historic pivot point. In exchange for Frankish military protection, the Pope offered something no earthly emperor could grant: a divine blessing, an anointing that legitimized Pepin's rule in the eyes of God and man. The deal was struck. Pepin's armies marched into Italy, defeated the Lombards, and in a moment that would echo for 1,000 years, he gifted a vast swath of central Italian territory to the Pope. This donation of Pepin did not just save Rome from another sacking, it created the Papal States, a sovereign kingdom ruled by the Bishop of Rome. With one strategic move, a pope seeking a protector had forged a weapon that would define the Middle Ages, binding the cross and the crown together in an alliance that would one day be called the Holy Roman Empire. The Lombard raids, a series of regional conflicts, had inadvertently triggered the birth of papal political power, proving that sometimes the greatest changes come not from a single cataclysm, but from the slow, constant pressure that forces a civilization to reinvent itself entirely. The alliance with the Franks had secured the Pope's lands, but it could not shield the entire coastline. From the sea, a new and terrifying form of warfare arrived, one that targeted not the city's political heart but its very soul. In the summer of 846, a powerful Saracen fleet sailing from their strongholds in Sicily and North Africa appeared at the mouth of the Tiber River. They did not even attempt to assault the massive Aurelian walls surrounding Rome itself. Instead, their armies landed and marched straight for the sprawling and crucially undefended basilicas that lay outside the city's protective embrace. These were the churches of St. Peter and St. Paul outside the walls, two of the most sacred sites in all of Christendom, filled with the relics of apostles and centuries of donated wealth. The Roman militia sent to stop them was crushed. The invaders smashed their way into the holy sanctuaries. They desecrated the tombs of the apostles, stripping them of gold and jewels, and carried off an immense hoard of sacred treasure. The psychological impact of this raid was even greater than the material loss. For a Saracen army to violate the holiest places of the Christian world, to loot the very tomb of St. Peter himself, was a shock that reverberated across Europe. It was a stark declaration that the Mediterranean was no longer a Roman lake, but a contested battleground between two expanding faiths. Pope Leo Roman IV understood the message perfectly. He could not allow the spiritual center of his authority to remain so vulnerable. In response, he launched the most ambitious building project in Rome in centuries, the construction of a massive new fortification around the Vatican Hill and the Basilica of St. Peter. These Leonine walls, named for the Pope himself, were a direct and physical reaction to the terror of the Saracen raid. They were a declaration that the Church would now defend itself with stone and mortar. Yet the threat was persistent. Even as the new walls rose, another Saracen raid tested their incomplete sections, a grim reminder that the danger from the sea was constant. This new era of conflict had forced the papacy to become a fortress builder, transforming the open, sacred landscape around St. Peter's into a fortified citadel, a tangible symbol of a world now permanently on guard. The Leonine walls had fortified the Church, but they could not shield it from a war of faith waged from within Christendom itself. A new kind of conflict was brewing, one not against foreign invaders, but for the very soul of Western Europe. This was the Investiture Controversy, a monumental struggle between Pope and Emperor over who held the ultimate authority, the right to appoint bishops and invest them with their spiritual and temporal power. On one side stood the formidable Pope Gregory VII, known as Hildebrand, a man of iron will and deep conviction who believed the Church must be purified, freed from the corrupting influence of secular rulers. His opponent was the equally determined Holy Roman Emperor Henry IV, who saw the appointment of bishops within his lands not as a religious matter, but as a cornerstone of his own political power. The clash was inevitable. When Henry defied the Pope's decrees, Gregory responded with the most devastating weapon in his arsenal. He excommunicated the emperor and declared him deposed, stripping him of his right to rule. Facing a rebellion from his own nobles who saw a chance to defy a weakened king, Henry was forced into a desperate act of submission. In the bitter cold of January 1077, the emperor stood for 3 days barefoot in the snow outside the castle of Canossa, a penitent beggar pleading for the Pope's forgiveness. It was a stunning political theater that worked. Gregory was compelled to lift the excommunication, but the peace was an illusion. Henry's humiliation at Canossa had bought him time, not victory. Once he had stabilized his own kingdom and rallied his armies, he turned his attention back to Rome, not as a penitent but as a conqueror. In March of 1084, his forces laid siege to the city. For 2 years, Pope Gregory held out, a beacon of defiance from within the walls of the Castel Sant'Angelo. But Henry was relentless. He broke into the city and, in a move designed to shatter the Pope's legitimacy, installed his own puppet, the antipope Clement III, who then crowned Henry as the legitimate Holy Roman Emperor within St. Peter's Basilica. Yet Henry's own troops were not enough to secure the entire city, where pockets of fierce resistance remained loyal to Gregory. To break the deadlock, Henry called upon his allies, the Norman warriors of southern Italy, led by Robert Guiscard. The Normans arrived with overwhelming force, but they were not there to save Pope Gregory. They were there to serve Henry's cause. What followed was a 3-day nightmare that eclipsed the emperor's own siege. The Norman sack was not a strategic military action. It was an orgy of violence and fire. They ran rampant through the city's ancient heart, setting entire districts ablaze. The greatest damage was inflicted upon the historic forums, the monumental center of classical Rome, where fires gutted venerable temples and public buildings. The Normans looted everything of value and took thousands of Romans as slaves. The man they had supposedly come to rescue, Pope Gregory VII, was so horrified by the destruction wrought by his so-called liberators that he was forced to flee Rome with them, a virtual prisoner. He would die in exile just over a year later, his life's work in ruins. This sack, carried out in the name of an emperor against a pope, revealed a terrifying new reality. The very alliance meant to protect the papacy had become the instrument of its deepest humiliation, and the eternal city had been burned not by pagans, but by baptized Christians in a war over who would command the faithful. The Norman army that entered Rome was a whirlwind of devastation. Robert Guiscard's warriors, ostensibly there to free Pope Gregory VII from Emperor Henry IV's siege, showed no loyalty to the city or its people. They saw Rome not as an ally to be liberated, but as a prize to be plundered. What began as a military intervention swiftly spiraled into a 3-day inferno of violence that eclipsed any damage Henry's imperial troops had caused. The Normans ran riot through the ancient heart of the city, their fury unchecked. They set entire districts ablaze, and the fires they lit were catastrophic, gutting the historic forums and reducing venerable classical monuments to smoldering shells. This was not a calculated seizure, it was an explosion of greed and destruction. The looting was universal, from the grandest churches to the humblest homes, and it was accompanied by indiscriminate massacres. But the ultimate horror for the citizens was the fate of thousands who were captured and dragged away into slavery, their lives and freedom bartered as mere spoils of war. This Norman rampage broke the back of the ancient Roman aristocratic families, whose power and wealth, accumulated over centuries, were wiped out in a few days of terror. For a time, Rome itself was under the brutal control of its supposed saviors, a stark showcase of the era's utter chaos. The Pope, who had called for help, watched in horror as his liberators destroyed the very city he sought to rule, a devastating lesson in the perils of inviting in a greater power to solve a political dispute. Rome was still reeling from the Norman inferno when a new kind of internal fracture began to tear it apart. Decades later, the struggle for control of the papacy had become a family affair, pitting rival Roman aristocratic clans against each other in a bitter fight for the throne of St. Peter. This time, the conflict centered on two men, Pope Innocent II and Antipope Anacletus II. Anacletus came from the powerful Pierleoni family, and with their wealth and influence, he secured the city of Rome itself, controlling the formidable Leonine walls and the fortress of St. Peter's. Innocent was forced to flee, taking his claim north to seek the backing of temporal power. He found his champion in the Holy Roman Emperor, Lothair III. For Lothair, this was a perfect opportunity. By backing the Pope, who seemed to have the broader support of the Church across Europe, he could reassert imperial authority over the papacy and secure his own coronation as emperor by the rightful pontiff. In the year 1130, Lothair marched his army into Italy and toward Rome with Pope Innocent at his side. But when they reached the city, they discovered a stark military reality. Anacletus and the Pierleoni family were not holed up in the city proper. They were locked safely within the impregnable fortress of the Vatican and the Castel Sant'Angelo. Lothair's forces could march through the streets, but they could not breach those walls. To demonstrate his power and to pay his troops, the emperor had to settle for a symbolic victory. His army fell upon the one place of immense symbolic value that lay undefended outside the fortress, the Lateran Palace. This was the ancient residence of the popes, the administrative heart of the worldwide church, filled with archives, regalia, and centuries of accumulated treasure. Lothair's soldiers looted it thoroughly. They seized papal tiaras, golden chalices, and priceless religious artifacts, a plunder not of pagan Rome, but of the very heart of Latin Christendom. This was a sack with a specific, almost surgical goal. It was not about destroying the city, but about humiliating a rival and funding a campaign. Lothair was even crowned emperor in the Lateran Basilica by Innocent, a ceremony performed not in St. Peter's as tradition demanded, but in the only major church his forces securely held. The event was a hollow victory. He left Rome with his gold and his title, but Anacletus remained unshaken in his fortress. The city itself had become a mere backdrop, its streets and palaces just stages upon which the real powers, the emperor and the warring popes, played out their high-stakes game. The true prize was not the city's walls, but the authority they contained. The sacred city had become a prize for emperors and popes, but a new and far more dangerous enemy was stirring within its own walls. Decades after the imperial looting of the Lateran, a revolutionary fire ignited in the hearts of Rome's common people. They looked around at the crumbling forums and the grand palaces of the cardinals and saw a bitter injustice. They were the descendants of the Romans who had built a republic, yet they lived as subjects in a city ruled by a religious court and a handful of wealthy families. This resentment crystallized into a movement known as the Commune of Rome, a direct challenge to the entire medieval order. Its spiritual leader was a fiery preacher named Arnold of Brescia, a man who denounced the wealth and political power of the church. He argued that the Pope should be a spiritual shepherd, not a temporal prince, and that the true rulers of Rome should be its citizens, just as in the ancient days of the Senate and the people. This was not a call for reform, it was a call for revolution. Inspired by this potent vision of a lost republic, the people rose up. Their fury was not aimed at foreign armies, but at the luxurious homes of the cardinals and the noble families who profited from the papal court. Mobs stormed these palaces not merely to loot their gold and silks, but to tear down the visible symbols of their oppression. They seized control of the Capitoline Hill, the very heart of ancient Roman government, and declared the rebirth of the Roman Republic. This was a sack from within, a class war fought in the same streets where Gauls and Goths had once marched. For a few turbulent years, the commune held power, a stunning reversal of the medieval social order. It proved that the idea of Rome was more powerful than any single emperor or pope. The memory of a republic, dormant for 1,000 years, could still inspire citizens to reclaim their city, demonstrating that the most enduring threats to power are often born from the legends it tries to claim for itself. The revolutionary dream of the commune had been crushed, but the underlying conflict between emperor and pope was a fire that refused to die. It found its most formidable champion in the German king Frederick I, a man known to history as Barbarossa for his fiery red beard. He was the embodiment of the Holy Roman Empire, a ruler who saw himself as the direct successor to the Caesars, and he believed his authority over Italy and the Church was absolute and God-given. His opponent was Pope Alexander III, a brilliant and stubborn diplomat who stood just as firmly for the independence of the papacy. For years, their war of words and armies had raged across the Italian peninsula. To break the deadlock, Frederick decided to strike at the heart of the problem. He convened a council of his own loyal bishops and, in a direct challenge to Alexander, had them elect his own candidate, who became the antipope Paschal III. With his puppet pope in tow, Barbarossa marched on Rome in the sweltering summer of 1167, determined to be crowned emperor by his own hand-picked pontiff. The Roman militia, still fiercely loyal to Pope Alexander, marched out to meet the imperial army at the gates. The fighting was brutal, but Frederick's seasoned German knights were unstoppable. They shattered the Roman lines and poured into the city. This was not a chaotic plunder like the Norman rampage, it was a calculated political sack. Frederick's soldiers targeted the strongholds of the Pope's supporters, seizing the Lateran Palace and the great basilicas, systematically looting them to fund his campaign and humiliate his rival. He achieved his immediate goal. The antipope Paschal was installed in St. Peter's, and he duly placed the imperial crown on Frederick Barbarossa's head. It seemed like a total victory for the emperor, but then, as his army occupied the city in the height of summer, an invisible enemy emerged from the surrounding marshes. A devastating plague, most likely malaria, began to sweep through the ranks of the victorious Germans. The disease did not distinguish between knight and foot soldier. It struck with terrifying speed and fury, wiping out entire companies. The chronicles of the time describe a scene of utter horror, with the proud imperial army dissolving into a mass of dying men. Frederick's own inner circle was decimated, with many of his closest princes and knights succumbing to the fever. In a matter of weeks, his triumphant force was annihilated not by Roman swords, but by microscopic parasites. The emperor was forced to abandon his new-won capital in a desperate, humiliating retreat, carrying the pestilence with him as he fled north. To everyone watching, the message was unmistakable. This was divine judgment. God had sacked the sackers, using the very air and water of Rome as his weapon. The city itself, it seemed, held a power that went beyond stone walls and human armies, a latent force that could strike down even the most powerful emperor when he dared to defy its ancient spirit. The very air of Rome seemed to crackle with the spirit of defiance. Decades after the plague had broken an emperor, the city's ancient republican ideals were not just a memory, they were a functioning government. The revived Roman Senate, once a symbol of the commune's rebellion, now wielded real authority, and it was determined to prove that the true ruler of Rome was Rome itself. Its greatest obstacle was not a foreign king, but the man residing across the Tiber, Pope Clement III. The Senate demanded full control over the city's revenues, its courts, and its fortifications, a direct challenge to the Pope's own claim as the city's temporal lord. This was a constitutional crisis, a cold war between two governments sharing the same 7 hills. In the year 1188, that Cold War turned hot. The Senate, backed by its own militia and the fervent support of the citizens, decided to settle the question of power with a show of force. They marched across the river and laid siege to the Vatican itself. This was not an attack by pagans or a distant empire. It was the civic government of Rome assaulting the spiritual heart of Western Christendom. The senatorial forces smashed their way into the sacred precincts surrounding St. Peter's Basilica. They did not seek to burn the church, but to dominate it. They looted the storerooms and treasury, seizing the wealth that funded the papal court. Their ultimate prize, however, was the person of the Pope. They effectively took Clement III prisoner within his own palace, a hostage to their political demands. For a time, the successor of St. Peter was not a prince ruling the city, but a captive of its elected officials. This internal coup revealed a profound and unsettling truth. After centuries of fearing armies from beyond the Alps or fleets from Africa, the most immediate threat to the papacy could be the very people it lived among. The sack by the Senate proved that the Eternal City's thirst for self-rule was a force as potent and dangerous as any barbarian horde, a civil war in slow motion that would define its destiny for centuries to come. The city's internal strife had become a permanent state of war, a cold conflict that now erupted into open flame. The great struggle between Pope and Emperor, which had once played out across all of Europe, was now a neighborhood feud in Rome, fought under the banners of the Guelphs and the Ghibellines. These were not foreign armies, but families who lived side by side, their loyalties split between the spiritual authority of the papacy and the temporal power of the Holy Roman Emperor. In 1241, the imperial faction, the Ghibellines, saw their chance to seize total control. With the backing of Emperor Frederick II's German mercenaries, they launched a coordinated assault from within. This was not a siege against the city walls, but a vicious purge of their political enemies. The Ghibelline mobs, guided by local rivalries and armed with imperial steel, surged through the districts loyal to the Pope. They targeted the fortified towers and palaces of the great Guelph families, not to conquer the city but to cleanse it. The violence was intimate and brutal. Homes were broken into and looted, not for treasure alone, but to erase the presence of the opposition. Strongholds were stormed and set ablaze, their smoke a declaration of victory in a civil war. For a time, the Ghibellines held Rome, and the Pope was forced to flee his own city, a refugee from his own flock. This partisan sack revealed a terrifying evolution in the city's endless cycle of violence. The enemy was no longer at the gates, he was your neighbor. The fight for Rome had devolved from a clash of empires into a street-level vendetta, proving that the most enduring wounds are often inflicted from within. The streets of Rome ran red with the blood of its own nobility. In the wake of the Battle of Tagliacozzo, the city braced for a reckoning, for the victor, Charles of Anjou, was not a man known for mercy. He had just crushed the dream of Conradin, the 16-year-old grandson of the great Frederick II and the last true heir of the Hohenstaufen line. This was more than a military defeat, it was the end of a dynasty, and Charles was determined to ensure its legacy was extinguished forever within the walls of Rome. His vengeance was not aimed at the city's walls or its churches, but at the very people who had dared to oppose him. The Roman Ghibellines, the aristocratic families who had thrown their support behind the young Conradin, now faced the full fury of the Angevin conqueror. This was a political purge, a systematic dismantling of an entire faction. Charles's supporters, the triumphant Guelphs, swept through the city with lists of names and warrants of arrest. They did not just seize the properties of their rivals, they sought to erase them. Grand family palaces, fortified towers that had dominated the Roman skyline for generations, were not merely looted but methodically torn down, their stones carted away as rubble. The message was as brutal as it was clear. Opposition would be made physically invisible, its roots dug up and burned. The most powerful Ghibelline families were broken, their leaders executed after swift, merciless trials, their wealth confiscated and handed over to loyal Guelph allies. This internal sack, carried out with legalistic precision, reshaped the social and physical landscape of Rome more profoundly than any fleeting barbarian raid. It solidified Guelph dominance for generations, ensuring the Pope would have no serious rival for temporal power within the city. The age of the Roman nobility as a counterweight to the papacy was over, its backbone shattered not by a foreign army, but by a calculated domestic terror. Yet the absence of a pope did not mean the city was quiet. Into this power vacuum stepped a man of the people, a charismatic visionary named Cola di Renzo. He was a commoner, a notary who had studied the ancient ruins and republican laws, and he dreamed of restoring Rome to its former glory, of reviving the Senate and driving out the corrupt barons who feuded in the streets. For a brief, spectacular moment, he succeeded. With the support of the citizenry, he seized power and declared himself tribune of the Roman people. But a dream of ancient glory requires a modern army to defend it. Lacking loyal troops of his own, Cola turned to the most readily available and most dangerous solution. He hired a company of Catalan mercenaries, hardened veterans of the wars in Italy and the Mediterranean. These were professional soldiers, men who fought for gold, not for flags or ideals. At first, their presence secured his shaky regime, but dreams do not fill a mercenary's purse. Cola's populist government, for all its lofty rhetoric, was desperately short of money. The taxes he promised failed to materialize, and the pay for the Catalans dried up. A well-paid mercenary is a guard dog, an unpaid one is a wolf. Restless, hungry, and feeling cheated, the Catalan company turned on the city they were hired to protect. They rampaged through the neighborhoods, their discipline replaced by pure greed. They looted homes, shops, and churches at will, answering any resistance with brutal violence. The man who had hired them, Cola di Renzo, was powerless to stop the chaos. His authority, built on speeches and ancient ideals, evaporated before the reality of drawn swords. The mercenaries did not answer to a republic, they answered to their own empty pockets. This was a sacking born not from foreign conquest, but from internal desperation, a stark lesson in the perils of purchasing power without the means to pay for it. The city learned that in the absence of true authority, the hired sword could swiftly become the master, and that the most volatile threat could be the one you invited inside your own gates. The city was learning a terrifying new lesson in the economics of fear. A decade after the Catalan mercenaries had exposed the danger of unpaid swords, a far larger and more organized threat appeared at the gates. This was not a king's army or a rival city's militia, but a corporate enterprise of violence known as the Great Company, a massive private army of thousands of seasoned professionals led by the infamous Fra Moriel. He was a former knight hospitaller who had traded his cross for a ledger book, and he understood that the most profitable plunder did not require a costly siege. His business model was extortion on a grand scale. The Great Company marched into the Roman countryside and simply set up camp, a silent, menacing presence. The message was clear and brutal. They would not attack, they would simply wait, consuming the land and letting the threat of absolute destruction fester in the minds of the citizens. Then Fra Moriel presented his bill, an astronomical ransom of gold florins, a sum so vast it was meant to cripple the city's treasury. Pay, and the company would peacefully depart. Refuse, and they would unleash a storm of fire and steel that would make the Norman rampage look like a minor disturbance. The Roman commune, still struggling to govern a fractured city, faced an impossible choice. They could not defeat this army in the field, and they could not withstand a sack, so they chose the only path that promised survival, however humiliating. A desperate, city-wide scramble for funds began. Taxes were levied, church treasures were reluctantly pledged, and the personal fortunes of wealthy merchants were forcibly borrowed. Every citizen, from the poorest laborer to the richest senator, felt the bite of this financial bleed as the commune scraped together the colossal ransom. When the final payment was handed over to Fra Moriel, the Great Company, true to its word, packed its tents and marched away, its coffers swollen but its swords clean. No buildings were burned, no citizens were slaughtered within the walls, yet Rome was left profoundly wounded, stripped of its liquid wealth and its sense of security. This was the economic sack, a shakedown that proved a piece of parchment demanding money could be as devastating as a battering ram, and that the most sophisticated threats to a city's survival no longer needed to break down its gates. The Cold War of faith had finally erupted into a hot, brutal fire. Just as the city began to recover from the financial shakedown of the Great Company, a far more intimate and ideological conflict tore the Christian world in two. This was the Western Schism, a crisis that saw not one, but two men claiming to be the true successor of Saint Peter, one in Rome and one in Avignon, each backed by rival kings and nations. The fight for the soul of the Church was no longer a matter of theological debate. It was about to be settled with Breton steel. The French-backed Pope in Avignon sent his most ruthless commander, Cardinal Robert of Geneva, into Italy with an army of Breton mercenaries. Their mission was simple: to crush all support for the Roman Pope Urban VI and terrorize the Papal States into submission. The Cardinal, a prince of the Church, proved to be a prince of terror. His campaign reached its bloody climax in the town of Cesena, after the citizens, believing they had secured a surrender, laid down their arms. Cardinal Robert gave his mercenaries a direct and chilling order. He commanded them to show no mercy. What followed was not a battle, it was a systematic slaughter. For 3 days, the Breton soldiers ran amok, murdering every man, woman, and child they could find. The streets ran red, with chroniclers of the time claiming the death toll reached into the thousands. This atrocity earned the Cardinal a new and enduring title, the Butcher of Cesena. With this act of calculated terror searing his name into the region's memory, he then turned his army toward Rome itself. The Breton sack of the Roman countryside was not a quest for plunder, but a campaign of pure intimidation. They burned villages and farms, creating a ring of fire and fear around the Eternal City, a clear message to Pope Urban and his supporters about the price of defiance. The violence was so extreme, so personal, that it revealed a horrifying truth. The sacred office of the Cardinal, meant to be a shepherd of souls, had been wielded as a weapon of mass murder. This was a new low in the long history of Rome's sufferings, a sack carried out in the name of God by a man who wore a bishop's mitre over a general's helmet, proving that the most savage wars are often fought over the highest ideals. The Breton terror had left the countryside in ashes, but the real prize remained tantalizingly out of reach. Yet the ambition to seize Rome was a fire that burned in many hearts, and none burned hotter than that of Ladislaus, the young and ruthlessly ambitious king of Naples. He did not see a city of God, but the key to a kingdom, the capital of a new Italian empire he was determined to build for himself. The Western Schism had left the Papal States leaderless and fractured, their defenses in disarray. For a man like Ladislaus, this was not a tragedy, it was an invitation. He marched his army north with ease, facing little organized resistance. The gates of Rome, weakened by internal strife and lacking a strong papal garrison, swung open before him almost without a fight. This was not a conquest born of a great battle, but a quiet, humiliating occupation. Once inside, Ladislaus revealed his true intentions. His soldiers conducted a systematic looting of the city's remaining wealth, but the king's strategy was more sophisticated than mere plunder. He imposed crippling new taxes on the Roman populace, a financial bleed designed to fund his wider wars and grind down any spirit of resistance. The city was not just being robbed, it was being milked like a farm animal. Then, in an act of pure, calculated theater, Ladislaus marched into St. Peter's Basilica. He did not come to pray. He ascended the steps, and before the stunned clergy and citizens, he deliberately sat down upon the high altar itself. This was more than a trespass, it was a symbolic coronation. By seating himself on the most sacred physical point of the Western Church, he was declaring that secular power now reigned supreme, that the throne of a king was higher than the altar of a pope. It was a direct challenge to the very concept of spiritual authority. For a time, it seemed he had won, but the institution of the papacy, though divided and wounded, possessed a resilience that outstripped any single king's ambition. The Roman Pope Gregory XII, though weak, still held the loyalty of key cardinals and, crucially, the financial backing of other Italian powers who feared Neapolitan dominance. They rallied their forces and funds, raising an army that finally pushed the overextended Ladislaus out of the city. His expulsion proved a vital lesson. A king could capture Rome, he could tax it and even desecrate its holiest site, but he could not truly possess its spirit. The papacy was an idea, and ideas are far harder to sack than cities. The age of the freelance warlord had arrived, and its master strategist was a man named Braccio da Montone. He was not a king or an emperor, but a condottiero, a mercenary captain who sold his army's services to the highest bidder. His battlefield genius was legendary, his ambition boundless, and in the year 1413, his employer was the King of Naples, who sought to humble the rebellious Roman barons. But Braccio's motives were a tangled web of duty and desire. He was serving his patron, yes, but he was also meticulously carving out a personal state for himself in central Italy, and Rome was the ultimate jewel he needed to secure his own dynasty. When he marched his professional army toward the city, it was not just a campaign, it was a calculated move on a grand chessboard of personal ambition. He laid siege to Rome not with endless assaults, but with a patient, grinding pressure that choked its supply lines and exposed the weakness of its divided defenders. The gates were eventually opened to him, some say by treachery from within, a common theme in a city perpetually at war with itself. Once inside, Braccio revealed the true nature of his trade. For several days, his soldiers were given free rein to conduct a systematic, businesslike looting of the city. This was not a frenzied riot, but a cold, efficient harvesting of wealth, a payment to his troops that his Neapolitan salary alone could not cover. They targeted the palaces of the wealthy barons and the treasuries of the civic government, stripping them of gold, art, and anything of tangible value. This sack was a perfect, chilling example of the new Italian reality. City-states like Rome were no longer prizes for empires, but chips in a high-stakes game played by military entrepreneurs who fought for a contract one day and for their own crown the next. Braccio da Montone did not want to burn Rome, he wanted to own a piece of it, and his methodical plunder was simply the cost of doing business in an era where the sword was the ultimate currency. The new terror wore a cardinal's red. Giovanni Vitelleschi was no prince of peace, but a prince of war, a papal commander whose faith was expressed through the sword. Sent by the Pope to crush the rebellious Roman barons and restore order, he arrived not with a benediction but with a professional army. His mission was to impose the authority of the Church by any means necessary. And the means he chose were absolute terror. This was a sack with a chillingly paradoxical goal: to save the city by breaking its spirit. Vitelleschi's soldiers, acting on his direct orders, turned their fury not on foreign walls, but on the very palaces and fortresses of the Roman nobility. They smashed their way into the fortified towers that had for generations been symbols of baronial independence. The looting was secondary to the lesson. Noble families were dragged from their homes and subjected to swift, merciless executions in the public squares, their blood a message to any who would defy the papal will. The destruction was methodical and symbolic. Entire family strongholds were not merely occupied but physically dismantled, their stones pulled down so they could never again serve as a bastion of resistance. This was a purge disguised as a police action, a calculated demonstration that the Church would now rule through fear. How does a shepherd protect his flock? By becoming the wolf that terrifies all other predators. Vitelleschi's sack for order proved that the most intimate and devastating violence could be officially sanctioned, delivered by the very hand that claimed to offer salvation. The crimson robes of a cardinal could not hide the ambitions of noble blood. In the sweltering summer of 1484, the sudden death of Pope Sixtus IV left a throne vacant and a city unprotected. This was the moment the great families had waited for, a chance to settle ancient scores while the hand of papal authority was lifted. The Colonna family, one of the oldest and most powerful dynasties in Rome, saw not a time for mourning but an opportunity for vengeance. Their target was their eternal rival, the Orsini clan, and their allies who had prospered under the late Pope's favor. The city's grand piazzas and winding alleys became a battlefield as the Colonna's private army surged across the Tiber. This was not a foreign invasion, but a civil war between neighbors who knew every backstreet and every weakness in each other's defenses. The fighting was intimate and brutal, a storm of steel and fire confined to the districts where their enemies lived. The Colonna men smashed into the fortified palaces of the Orsini, not to conquer Rome, but to humiliate and cripple their rivals. They tore through lavish halls, seizing gold, artwork, and family heirlooms, while in the streets, their retainers clashed in furious melees that left the cobblestones slick with blood. For days, the city was held hostage by this private feud, its civic government powerless to intervene. The raid was a stark reminder that the grandeur of the Renaissance, with its art and learning, was built upon a foundation of festering hatreds and violent rivalries. The true enemy of Rome's peace was not always a foreign army or a mercenary company, but the smiling nobleman who lived in the palace next door, waiting for his moment to strike. A new kind of war was thundering down the Italian peninsula, and its herald was the roar of French cannon. King Charles VIII of France, a young man obsessed with dreams of crusading glory, marched his army across the Alps in 1494, claiming a distant inheritance to the throne of Naples. His force was a spectacle of modern warfare, a column of Swiss pikemen and armored knights supported by a train of powerful, mobile bronze artillery. The Italian city-states, with their armies of elegant condottieri who fought more for show than for slaughter, were utterly unprepared. They shattered before him like glass, their fortified castles crumbling under a barrage of iron shot. The road to Rome lay open, not through betrayal or siege, but through sheer, overwhelming technological shock. When Charles entered the Eternal City in December of that year, there was no battle. There was only a tense, humiliating negotiation. Pope Alexander VI, the cunning Borgia pontiff, knew his walls could not withstand the French guns. He retreated to the fortified Castel Sant'Angelo, not to fight but to bargain. The result was not a bloody rampage but a calculated, diplomatic shakedown. Charles and his ministers demanded passage through papal lands and a staggering financial tribute. Under the shadow of those cannons, the Pope had no choice but to agree. The French extorted a fortune in gold and jewels from the Vatican treasury, and they secured from Alexander a symbolic and deeply galling concession: the custody of a key Ottoman prince the Pope held as a hostage, a move designed to bolster Charles's imagined crusade. This was a sack without fire or sword, a financial bleed that left the city intact but its treasury and its pride deeply wounded. The French army marched out of Rome richer and more powerful than when it entered, having proven that the rules of power in Italy had changed forever. The age of the condottiero was over, and the age of the national army, with its world-shattering guns, had begun. How do you defend a city when its very stones can be blasted into dust by an enemy you never even have to see? The French cannons had barely fallen silent when the pendulum of power swung back with a vengeance. A grand coalition of Italian states, the Holy Roman Empire, and Spain united to push the French intruders out of Italy. Their combined armies, a formidable force of Spanish infantry and German landsknechts, marched to liberate Rome from the pro-French faction holding it. The city's gates were open to its supposed saviors, and the citizens breathed a sigh of relief, but their liberation was a fleeting illusion. The very troops who had come to free them now looked upon Rome's wealth with hungry eyes. Their pay was late, their commanders looked the other way, and the temptation was simply too great. The Spanish and imperial soldiers, who had just days before been hailed as allies, turned on the city they were sent to protect. For several days, a chaotic and brutal looting ensued. This was not a strategic seizure, but a spontaneous outburst of greed from an army that saw its chance. They ransacked homes, shops, and churches, their violence proving that no banner, whether friend or foe, could be trusted. The civilian population, caught between rival powers, learned the hardest lesson of this chaotic era. In a city perpetually at war, any army, even one flying the flag of an ally, was just another pack of wolves waiting for the leash to slip. How quickly could a liberator become a predator? The Spanish and imperial troops answered with fire and plunder, demonstrating that the greatest danger to Rome was often the very force it invited inside to keep it safe. The cannons of foreign kings had retreated, but the most intimate threat was yet to arrive from within the papal palace itself. In the year 1501, the true power in Rome was not the aging Pope Alexander VI, but his son, Caesar Borgia. Caesar was a cardinal who had traded his red hat for a soldier's armor, a man of ruthless ambition and chilling charisma. His goal was nothing less than the creation of a Borgia kingdom in central Italy, and Rome was the first and most crucial piece on his chessboard. This was not a sack by a foreign army, but a silent, internal coup orchestrated from the very heart of the Vatican. Caesar used his private army, paid for with papal gold, to seize direct control of the city's streets. His methods were a masterclass in political terror. He compiled lists of his enemies, the powerful noblemen whose loyalty he doubted or whose wealth he coveted. Under the cover of papal authority, his soldiers conducted targeted arrests in the dead of night. Men vanished from their beds, never to be seen again, victims of convenient accidents or swift private executions. Their fortified palaces were not stormed by a mob, but quietly confiscated, their treasures flowing into the Borgia coffers. One of the most chilling examples was the fate of the Orsini family, his family's ancient rivals. Caesar invited their leaders to a peace conference at his castle, only to take them prisoner the moment they arrived. He used them as hostages to force the surrender of their family strongholds, systematically dismantling their power structure with cold precision. This was a political sack where the violence was surgical and the plunder was power itself. The message to the cardinals and nobles of Rome was unmistakable. Defy the Borgias, and you would not face an army at your gates, you would face a knife in the dark. Caesar Borgia proved that the most effective way to plunder the Eternal City was not to break down its walls, but to seize the keys from the man who held them, his own father, the Pope. The terror of a Borgia prince paled before the fury of an emperor. By the spring of 1527, the political chessboard of Italy was in shambles. Pope Clement VII had made a fatal miscalculation, switching his alliance from the Holy Roman Emperor Charles V to the King of France. In response, an imperial army marched on Rome, but this was no disciplined force on a royal mission. It was a ravenous horde of 34,000 mutinous soldiers, a toxic mix of German Lutheran landsknechts, Spanish Catholic tercios, and Italian mercenaries. They were united not by loyalty, but by a shared, burning rage. Their pay was months, and in some cases years, overdue. They were cold, hungry, and saw the richest city in Christendom as the only bank that could settle their debt. Pope Clement, believing the massive Aurelian walls were impregnable and that a deal could be struck, sent envoys to negotiate. The talks collapsed instantly. The imperial commanders, who had little real control over their men, demanded an impossible ransom. On the morning of May 6, the army simply attacked. It was less a military assault and more a spontaneous, furious surge against the fortifications. Incredibly, they found a weakly defended section near the Janiculum Hill. The Swiss Guard, the Pope's personal protectors, fought and died to the last man in a heroic rearguard action. buying Clement just enough time to flee through a secret passage, the Passetto di Borgo, to the safety of the Castel Sant'Angelo. He left the city and its people to their fate. What followed was not a sack but an apocalypse. For weeks, the imperial soldiers unleashed a hellscape of violence and sacrilege that shocked all of Europe. The German Lutherans, seeing Rome as the capital of the Antichrist, took special delight in desecrating churches. They stabled their horses in St. Peter's Basilica, used ancient manuscripts for target practice, and smashed holy relics. Nuns were dragged from convents and subjected to unspeakable horrors. Noblemen were tortured to reveal the hiding places of their wealth, their bodies broken on improvised racks. The streets ran with blood and were littered with the dead, so many that the stench of decay hung over the city for months. The Spanish and Italian troops proved just as brutal, systematically stripping palaces and homes of every valuable, from gold chalices to simple kitchen pots. The artistic heart of the Renaissance was torn out, with workshops looted and sculptures defaced. The population was decimated, falling from 55,000 to just 10,000 souls through murder, flight, and disease. The psychological and cultural impact was catastrophic. The Great Sack of 1527 marked the brutal end of the Roman Renaissance. The city's confidence, its artistic flowering, its very sense of being the center of the world evaporated overnight. Pope Clement became a prisoner in his own fortress, a humiliated supplicant who eventually had to surrender key territories and pay a colossal ransom. The event signaled a definitive power shift. The age of the Italian city-state was over, and the era of the great national monarchies of Spain and the Holy Roman Empire had begun. The Eternal City had been punished not by barbarians, but by the very forces of a new, modern Europe it had tried and failed to control. The stench of death lingered for months. Corpses choked the Tiber, and the city's population, which had stood at 55,000, was utterly decimated, collapsing to a mere 10,000 souls through brutal murder, rampant disease, and a desperate mass exodus. Tens of thousands became refugees, fleeing a city that was now a charnel house, their flight a silent testament to the absolute collapse of order. The cultural devastation was just as profound. The workshops of Renaissance masters were stripped bare, their paintings and sculptures carried off to northern castles or melted down for bullion. Priceless libraries were burned, their ancient manuscripts used as bedding for horses or simply tossed onto bonfires, the accumulated knowledge of centuries turning to ash in an afternoon. From his prison in the Castel Sant'Angelo, Pope Clement VII could only watch the smoke rise over his ruined dioceses. He was a captive in every sense, trapped not only by the imperial army camped outside his walls, but by his own catastrophic miscalculation. For weeks, he remained a virtual prisoner, eventually forced to surrender key papal fortresses and cities, and agree to an astronomical ransom to save what was left of his office and his life. Across Europe, the news was met with a mixture of horror and grim satisfaction. Many, especially in the growing Protestant north, saw the hellscape in Rome not as a military atrocity but as a clear act of divine judgment, a punishment from God upon a corrupt and worldly papacy that had lost its spiritual way. The long-term legacy of this great sack was a complete reshaping of the Italian peninsula. The power of the independent papacy was broken, and Spanish influence, exercised through the Holy Roman Emperor Charles V, became the dominant political force in Italy for the next century and a half. Yet, from this utter devastation, a new resolve was born within the wounded church. The trauma of 1527 became a powerful catalyst, a shocking wake-up call that helped ignite the Catholic Counter-Reformation. It spurred a movement of internal renewal, a drive to purify the church, reform its institutions, and reclaim its spiritual authority through a reinvigorated and militant faith. The city's darkest hour thus planted the seed for its next great transformation, proving that even from the deepest ashes, a phoenix can find a reason to rise. The trauma of the Great Sack had left the papacy deeply wary of imperial power, but some wounds fade faster than resolve. 3 decades later, an aging and fiercely independent Pope, Paul IV, looked at the map of Italy and saw not a lesson in caution but a cage. The Spanish Habsburgs, whose troops had ravaged Rome in 1527, now dominated the peninsula, and this proud pontiff, a former inquisitor, saw their influence as a poison to be purged. He formed an alliance with France and, in a breathtaking act of defiance, declared war on the most powerful empire in the world. It was a gamble of epic proportions, and the response was swift and terrifying. The Spanish viceroy in Naples, the iron-willed Duke of Alba, marched north at the head of a veteran army. This was not a mutinous rabble, but a disciplined professional force, the very instrument of Habsburg might. They sliced through the Papal States with brutal efficiency, brushing aside the Pope's own meager forces and advancing relentlessly toward the Eternal City. Panic once again gripped Rome, the memories of the last sack flooding back, but the Duke of Alba was a soldier, not a butcher. His goal was not destruction, but submission. He halted his army just outside the gates, a silent, menacing presence that made the very air feel heavy. The message was clear: surrender now or relive the nightmare. With no army left to field and his French allies offering no help, the proud Pope Paul IV was utterly broken. He had no choice but to sue for peace. The terms of surrender were a masterclass in political humiliation. The Duke of Alba forced the Pope to disband what remained of the papal military, stripping the Church of its ability to defend itself. Spanish troops occupied key fortresses and territories, ensuring that Rome was now physically encircled by its enemy. And most painfully, the peace treaty included a forced perpetual alliance, legally binding the papacy to Spanish foreign policy. In a single diplomatic stroke, the Pope had been transformed from a sovereign prince into a client of Spain. This was a sacking of sovereignty, a plunder of political will that left the city physically intact but its spirit in chains. The Duke of Alba had proven that in the new world of great powers, an army did not need to burn a city to conquer it. It only needed to stand outside the walls and dictate the future from a tent. Even the Pope's personal guards could turn on their master. The reign of the fierce and stubborn Pope Paul IV was ending, but one final, humiliating crisis was about to erupt from within his own household. For months, the Pope's elite corps of Corsican soldiers had grown restless. These men were his personal protectors, yet their wages had gone unpaid, a victim of the same empty treasury that had crippled the papal army in the recent war against Spain. Their loyalty, bought with gold, was now evaporating in the heat of their frustration. The mutiny began not with a shout, but with a slow, simmering anger that finally boiled over. The Corsicans abandoned their posts and took to the streets not as guardians of order, but as a violent, armed mob. Their target was not a foreign enemy, but the city they were sworn to defend. They clashed directly with other papal troops, the few soldiers still loyal to the Pope's command, turning the neighborhoods around the Vatican into a chaotic urban battlefield. Swords were drawn in skirmishes between men who had once served the same banner, a civil war within the papal military itself. But the Corsicans' true fury was reserved for the citizens of Rome. They smashed their way into shops and the homes of wealthy merchants, seizing whatever valuables they could carry as a form of direct, violent payment for their services. For a few terrifying hours, the very instruments of the Pope's power became the source of the city's terror, proving that a bankrupt state could not even control its own sword. Order was only restored when sufficient funds were hastily gathered and promises of payment were made, but the damage to the papacy's authority was profound. The Corsican mutiny was a small but piercingly clear symptom of a deep and persistent disease. It showed that the financial rot within the papal states was so severe it could turn the papal household against itself, creating instability from the one place that was supposed to be a bastion of absolute control. The Pope's alliance with France now drew a new army toward the beleaguered city. In 1557, the Duke of Guise, a formidable French commander, answered Pope Paul IV's call, marching into Italy to break the Spanish stranglehold. His campaign was not aimed at conquering Rome itself, but at striking the Spanish forces and, by extension, liberating the papacy from its humiliating vassalage. Yet for the people living in the vast, fertile plains surrounding the Eternal City, the Campagna Romana, this war of liberation felt no different from any other invasion. The French army, like all armies of the era, lived off the land, but the Duke of Guise's campaign was one of deliberate, systematic extraction. His soldiers fanned out across the countryside, descending upon undefended towns and villages that had supplied Rome with grain, wine, and livestock for centuries. They did not just take what they needed for a day's march, they methodically stripped entire regions bare. Storehouses were emptied, fields were burned, and livestock was driven away. This was a sack of the hinterland, a strategic plunder of the very resources that sustained the metropolis. The city's massive walls remained unbreached, its monuments untouched, but the effect was a slow, suffocating chokehold. With the supply lines from the Campagna severed, the price of bread in Rome skyrocketed. Markets grew barren, and a deep anxiety gripped a population that knew starvation was a far more patient and insidious enemy than any swordsman. The Duke of Guise demonstrated a brutal new reality of early modern warfare. A city could be brought to its knees not by shattering its gates, but by burning its larders and salting its fields, proving that true power often lies in controlling the roads that lead to the kitchen, not the palace. While the popes fought wars with kings, a different kind of enemy was rising from the very soil of Italy. The late 16th century saw the Papal States gripped by a plague of banditry so vast and organized it became a shadow government. These were not lone thieves, but entire armies, sometimes thousands strong, led by charismatic and dispossessed nobles who had lost their lands and titles in the endless political squabbles. Their ranks swelled with hardened veterans from the Italian wars, men who knew no trade but violence and had been cast aside by the very powers they once served. How could a bandit army challenge the authority of the Pope himself? They did not need to storm the walls of Rome to conquer its territory. Instead, they simply took control of it, village by village, road by road. These bandit captains established their own fortified bases in the rugged hills of the Campagna, operating with the impunity of feudal lords. From these strongholds, they launched devastating raids on towns loyal to the Pope, demanding protection money and seizing harvests. They ambushed travelers and merchants on the vital roads leading into the Eternal City, holding nobles and wealthy clerics for exorbitant ransoms. This was a constant, low-level sacking, a slow bleed of wealth and security that made the entire countryside a lawless frontier. The papal government in Rome would send its soldiers on campaigns to root them out, but the bandits, with their local knowledge and networks of informants, would simply melt back into the landscape, only to return the moment the troops departed. For decades, this persistent shadow war proved that a city could be besieged not by a single army at its gates, but by a hydra of 1,000 smaller threats, each one gnawing at the roots of its power and proving that true control was an illusion in a land teeming with desperate, armed men who had learned to write their own rules. Even the smallest spark could ignite a border war. For decades, the frontier between the Papal States and the Grand Duchy of Tuscany had been a map of simmering resentments, a line drawn less by geography than by the shifting ambitions of rival dynasties. The Medici Grand Dukes in Florence were determined to expand their influence, and the popes in Rome were just as determined to hold every inch of their ancient lands. This tension was a constant, low hum in the background of Italian politics, a reminder that peace was often just a pause between conflicts. In the spring of 1605, that hum became a roar. A dispute over a few strategically vital villages and the control of their toll revenues escalated beyond diplomacy. the Tuscan army, a modern and well-drilled force, received its orders and marched across the contested border. Their target was not Rome itself, but the papal fortress town of Sit Adela Pieve, a sentinel perched on the hills overlooking the trade routes. The town's garrison was completely unprepared for the scale of the assault. The Tuscans smashed through its defenses with brutal efficiency, their cannons breaching gates that had stood for centuries. Once inside, the soldiers were unleashed. This was not the apocalyptic fury of a great sack, but a calculated, localized plunder. They looted the town's municipal buildings, seized the treasury, and systematically stripped the homes of the local nobility and wealthy merchants. Churches were not spared, their silver sacramental vessels and golden ornaments taken as spoils of war. The population was subjected to the usual horrors of a military occupation, their livelihoods and sense of security shattered in a matter of hours. After taking what they wanted and demonstrating their power, the Tuscan forces withdrew, leaving Sit Adela Pieve battered and humiliated. Why does this small raid matter in the grand saga of Rome's 35 sackings? It serves as a perfect, chilling example of the perpetual friction that defined the Italian peninsula. Even in an era of supposed peace, the threat of violence was ever present, a tool of statecraft used to settle petty disputes and enforce territorial claims. The raid was a message sent from Florence and received in Rome that no border was truly safe, and that the peace of the Papal States could be violated at any moment by a neighbor with a grudge and a loaded cannon. This constant, low-grade warfare was a slow bleed that weakened the city's periphery, reminding everyone that the eternal city's influence stopped where the next state's ambition began. A new kind of plunder was unfolding, one that wore the robes of a pope and the chisel of a sculptor. For centuries, Rome's conquerors had taken its treasures through fire and sword, but under the reign of Pope Urban VIII, a man from the powerful Barbarian family, the city began to consume itself. This was not a violent sack, but an artistic one, a systematic dismantling of the ancient past to fuel the glorious ambitions of the present. The Pope was a great patron of the arts, a man who believed his mission was to make Rome the unrivaled capital of the Christian world, and he employed the era's greatest genius, Gian Lorenzo Bernini, to achieve it. But this grand vision had a terrible cost, one paid not in gold from the treasury, but in bronze ripped from the city's very bones. The most shocking act was the decision to strip the ancient bronze girders from the portico of the Pantheon. This temple, a marvel of Roman engineering that had survived intact for over 1,500 years, was now seen as a quarry. The precious metal was melted down, with most of it cast into cannons to fortify the Castel Sant'Angelo, turning a monument to pagan gods into weapons for a papal fortress. The rest was used by Bernini to create the soaring, spiraling bronze columns of the magnificent baldachin, the ceremonial canopy over the high altar of St. Peter's Basilica. What could possibly justify such an act? For the Barbarian Pope, it was a simple equation of utility, a necessary sacrifice of the old to build the new and defend the faith. But for the people of Rome, it was an unspeakable sacrilege. Their outrage found a voice in the city's famous talking statues, where anonymous critics would post satirical poems known as pasquinades. One phrase, written in Latin, captured the public fury perfectly and has echoed down the centuries. It read, "Quod non fecerunt barbari, fecerunt barbarini." What the barbarians did not do, the Barbarini did. The Goths, the Vandals, the Normans, they had all left the Pantheon untouched, respecting its majesty or perhaps simply overlooking its hidden structural wealth. It was a pope, a man charged with being the guardian of civilization, who had ordered its mutilation. This artistic sack reveals a profound and unsettling truth about the nature of preservation. The greatest threat to a city's memory is not always the foreign army that seeks to burn it, but the native generation that fails to see its value, viewing immortal monuments as mere raw material for their own fleeting legacy. The spirit of insurrection is a plague that respects no borders. While Rome had endured the plunder of emperors and the terror of mercenaries, a new kind of storm was brewing to the south in the teeming, sun-baked city of Naples. There, a charismatic fisherman named Masaniello ignited a massive popular revolt against the crushing weight of Spanish taxes and aristocratic privilege. For a few dizzying days, the common people held the city, their fury a beacon for the oppressed across Italy. That beacon's light shone directly into the heart of Rome, where the same resentment simmered just beneath the surface of papal control. The Roman populace, burdened by their own heavy taxes and the ostentatious wealth of the Barberini and other noble families, saw in the Neapolitan revolt a blueprint for their own liberation. The cry of rebellion leaped from the piazzas of Naples to the streets of Rome, and the city's own commoners rose up, turning their anger against the symbols of their subjugation. They targeted the customs houses and the palaces of the tax collectors, their actions a direct challenge to the financial machinery that enriched the few at the expense of the many. But this was not a war against a foreign army, it was a civil war against an established order, and that order reacted with a swift, cold fury. The Pope, Innocent X, saw the uprising not as a cry for justice, but as a deadly contagion that threatened to unravel the entire social fabric. In a stark demonstration of where true power resided, he made a pact with his old rivals, the Spanish. Their shared interest in crushing popular dissent overcame generations of political friction. Spanish troops, the very enforcers whose rule was being challenged in Naples, now marched alongside the papal militia through the streets of Rome. Their mission was not to plunder the city's art, but to purge its rebellious spirit. The reprisal was merciless. They descended upon the working-class neighborhoods that had supported the revolt, not for a chaotic looting, but for a systematic punishment. This was a sack for order. Soldiers broke down doors, dragging suspected ringleaders into the public squares for immediate, brutal executions, their bodies left on display as a grim warning. The targeted neighborhoods were subjected to a controlled, terrifying violence, their homes and workshops ransacked by troops acting under official sanction. The collaboration between the cross and the crown was absolute, a united front of authority determined to teach the masses a final, bloody lesson. The Neapolitan revolt may have been crushed in its birthplace, but its echo in Rome proved that the greatest fear of any ruling class is not an external enemy, but the moment its own people stop obeying. The age of the great rampages was over, but the appetite for Rome's treasures had simply become more refined. By the 1740s, the city existed in a strange twilight, no longer the battleground for popes and emperors, but a beautiful museum under the watchful eyes of distant European powers. The War of the Austrian Succession, a sprawling conflict over thrones and territories, seemed a distant affair fought in Flanders and Bavaria, yet its long arm reached directly into the heart of the Papal States. An Austrian army, acting on strategic necessity, marched in to occupy key territories, claiming the action was to prevent papal support for their enemies. There were no furious assaults on the Aurelian walls, no citizens butchered in the streets. This was an occupation, not a sack, carried out with the cold efficiency of a modern state. And that made the plunder that followed all the more devastating. The Austrian commanders, many of them men of culture and education, did not unleash their soldiers in a frenzy. Instead, they arrived with lists. They systematically identified the greatest artistic and historical treasures held in papal palaces and the luxurious villas of the Roman nobility. This was a bureaucratic seizure, an artistic extraction authorized by official decree. They took everything: priceless paintings by the masters of the Renaissance, ancient Roman statues unearthed in recent excavations, and irreplaceable manuscripts from the Vatican's own archives were carefully catalogued, crated, and loaded onto wagons. The convoy then began its long journey north across the Alps, destined to fill the galleries and libraries of Vienna. This was not the chaotic greed of landsknechts or the fiery iconoclasm of Lutherans. It was the calculated cultural strip mining of an enlightened empire. How do you measure the loss when a city's soul is shipped away in wooden boxes? The Austrian occupation proved that the most effective plunder requires no smoke or screams, only a quiet man with an inventory and the power to enforce it. The cycle of plunder and survival has left an indelible mark on the city's soul. From the Gallic chieftain Brennus demanding gold with his sword to the Austrian commanders shipping away crates of Renaissance masterpieces, this incredible journey through 35 epic sackings reveals a story not just of destruction, but of an almost supernatural resilience. The same themes echo across the centuries, a relentless lust for treasure, whether it was the Vandals methodically stripping the temple of Jupiter or the Normans seizing thousands into slavery. And always there was the city's enduring symbolic power, a prize so potent that emperors and popes, revolutionaries and mercenaries, all believed that to possess Rome was to command the world itself. These events did not merely happen to Rome, they forged it. They shaped its physical landscape, leaving the Aurelian walls scarred and rebuilt, the forums burned and overgrown, and the Vatican transformed into a fortress. They decimated its population time and again, only to see new generations drift back to the Seven Hills. They scattered its art to the four winds, creating a diaspora of Roman beauty that would ironically spread its cultural influence far and wide. And they ultimately reshaped its place in the world, from the capital of a global empire to the heart of a global church, and finally to a monument of memory. Rome's true genius lies in this unique ability to absorb catastrophe, to let each wave of destruction wash over it and then reinvent itself from the rubble. It is a city built not just on stone, but on the stubborn refusal to disappear. So what do you think after this epic historical adventure? Which of these 35 sackings did you find the most shocking? Was it the calculated humiliation by the Gauls, the apocalyptic fury of the imperial soldiers in 1527, or the quiet, bureaucratic plunder by the Austrians? Let us know in the comments which era of Roman history fascinates you